Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to this webinar session entitled Housing Options for Domestic Violence Survivors 101. NCADV is honored to partner with the National Endowment for Financial Education, NEFI, to provide this second installment in a series of 6 free webinars to provide essential financial literacy skills, like building a modest financial foundation and making plans for the future. Along with Sexual Assault Awareness Month, April is also Financial Literacy Awareness Month. You can follow @Money Management, which is Money Management International, on Twitter for tools and solutions for overcoming financial challenges. My name is Sheba McCants, and I'm the Outreach Programs Manager for NCADV, and I'm joined today by Jeanette Schultz, Director of Financial Workshop Initiatives for NEFI, and we will be co-presenting today's webinar. A couple of things before we get into the webinar objectives. If you have a question, please feel free to enter it into the questions box on your control panel. We have a screenshot to the right of your screen for where to find the questions box. And we will be incorporating questions that you all asked in advance via the registration form throughout the webinar. And we also have time set aside at the end to answer questions. Also, I wanted to remind you, did you remember to download the handouts? We have a copy of the PowerPoint, a certificate of participation, and much more. And those handouts can be found in your control panel under handouts. We will be referring to one of the handouts called Webinar 2 Handouts, which contains various financial education activities, as well as the Smart About Money housing course. So please feel free to download that handout now so you know what we're referring to. And lastly, a recording of this webinar will be shared via email with all participants.
I also want to let you know about the NEFI Financial Workshop Kits, which are free to help you teach money management skills. They can be found at www.financialworkshopkits.org. Customizable financial workshop kits include PowerPoint presentation, scripts, handouts, other resources and activities you might find helpful. Additionally, we provide answers to frequently asked questions about how to effectively reach your specific audience.
All right, so throughout this webinar, we will be using one of our interactive tools. And that is the hand raise tool. So take a moment to find the hand raise tool in your control panel. We also have a screenshot of where to find that. And let's practice, actually. Go ahead and raise your hand if you found the hand raise tool. It's really cool for us to see that because it sees that you all are engaged and involved in what we're talking about. And so, so when you get a question prompt from me, you can click that hand raise tool if you agree. We did get good feedback on the hand raise tool from the first webinar, so we're going ahead and trying that again this time. All right, so before we get into today's webinar, we have a series of polls that we'd like for you all to take in order for us to get to know you, today's webinar audience. So our first poll, let's go ahead and start with the first poll. Who is participating today? So go ahead and indicate there, live and in real time, who is participating on today's webinar. Let's get some more votes in. As many people as we can, that'd be great. Looking good so far. Okay, we can go ahead and close that out. And we're going to share the results with you today in real time. So 83% of today's webinar audience has indicated that they are either a domestic violence or a sexual assault advocate. That could be a family, shelter, or a legal advocate. Another 22% have indicated that they are either case managers or counselors. And 7% indicated that they are a victim or a survivor, 2% in law enforcement or legal. And then for our folks that indicated other, I like that you're typing those in. We have a grants manager, we have a board member, a peer counselor, a legal advocate director. Very, very good. Okay, let's go ahead on to our next poll. Where are you located? It's always interesting for us to know where our attendees are coming from or tuning in from throughout the country. So go ahead and indicate now where you are located. Awesome, the results are just pouring in. Great job, everyone. Go ahead and take a few minutes to vote. Okay, we'll go ahead and close that out, looking good. About 41% of you have indicated that you are tuning in from the East Coast, another 20% from the Midwest, 21% from our southern states, 11% from the West Coast, and 7% from the mountain region. Let's go ahead on to the next poll. What is your racial or ethnic identity? And for that one, you are able to select multiple responses. So go ahead and indicate what is your racial or ethnic identity. Great job. Let's get a couple more votes in. Okay, that looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and close that out. All right, so according to today's poll, about 65% of the webinar audience has identified as white or Caucasian. About 22% have identified as Black, African, or African American. 16% Hispanic or Latinx. We also have 4% Asian or Pacific Islander, and then 2% American Indian or Alaskan Native. Thank you. We'll go ahead on to the next poll. All right, so this question is program specific. So if you're tuning in as a part of a program, is your organization currently offering mobile advocacy? And mobile advocacy is defined as, are you working with survivors in their communities and homes, accompanying survivors as they look for housing, go to court, or attempt to secure child care or health care? So how many of you are participating or have programming which would involve mobile advocacy? Okay, we can go ahead and close that out. Excellent. So about 69% of today's webinar audience has indicated that yes, we are offering mobile advocacy as a part of our programming. 27% are saying that no, they're not. And then 4% are saying they don't know. Maybe that's just something you can look into after this webinar. We'll go ahead on to the final poll for the day. We like to get a sense for, who's tuning into this webinar. So is this information for you or for those you serve? Are you tuning into this webinar to learn more about housing, maybe for yourself, or are you thinking of it, or are you using the information to be able to use it for the clients that you serve? Okay, we can close that out. Okay, this is an informative one for us. Thank you. And so it looks like about 90% of you are saying that you're using the information for those that you serve. So, and then 10% are saying that they would like to learn more about financial education or housing for themselves. Great, so thank you so much for that awesome feedback. It's really helpful for us to know who is, quote unquote, in the room with us today. All right, I asked on the registration form, I asked for folks to self-identify in terms of what community type they belong to. And I thought the results were interesting and wanted to share those with you. So it said, so the results were that the majority of the webinar audience is tuning in today from rural communities. So that was about 140 of you out of about 330 attendees from when I pulled this report. So, and then we also had about 120 attendees from urban communities. And then the smallest category was about 60 attendees from suburban community types. All right, so we're gonna get started with a short video, but before we do, I want you to use the hand raise tool in your control panel, and we'd like to get a show of hands. How many people on this webinar have heard of Safe Housing Partnerships? Go ahead and raise your hand if you've heard of Safe Housing Partnerships. SafeHousingPartnerships.org is the new website for the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. I will cover that organization in depth later in the webinar. The message of this video, which is that nobody should have to choose between staying in an unsafe home and having no home at all, is at the core of the work that you all do every day, and we genuinely appreciate that. You all, better than anyone, understand the connection between domestic and sexual violence and safe and affordable housing. So let's go ahead and check out the video. Yeah, can you replay it? Thank you.
Nobody should have to choose between staying in an unsafe home or having no home at all.
That's what I was trying to
But too often, that's the choice survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault have to make. Studies show that access to safe, affordable housing is one of survivors' biggest, most urgent concerns. This is why we can't end homelessness without a need for safety and confidentiality, economic instability, and the effects of trauma. And these barriers are often greater for those who are most marginalized in our society, including families of color, Native Americans, immigrants, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and individuals and families living in poverty or who are geographically isolated. So if we are going to end homelessness, we have to understand the connections between domestic violence, sexual violence, and housing instability, and create a framework that responds to the unique challenges and opportunities this intersection creates. In order to meet the needs of survivors and their families, we also need a greater range of housing options, from emergency shelters to transitional housing, to rapid rehousing, to permanent supportive housing. We need to continue to build the capacity of housing and homelessness programs to support survivors' safety, autonomy, and self-determination. And we need to build and strengthen partnerships between domestic and sexual violence organizations and housing and homelessness programs at the local, state, and national levels. These partnerships will give us the resources, strategies, and support we need as advocates, and the programs and policies that will support survivors' safety and stability. Together, through partnerships like these and survivor-centered policies and practices, we can end homelessness and improve families' lives. Learn more about survivor-centered housing at safehousingpartnerships.org.
All right. So that I really loved that video. I loved how it illustrated sort of all of the ways that homelessness and domestic violence are connected. So on that note, it is numbers time. We're going to share some statistics. And these statistics come from a report called A Promising Approach to Prevent Homelessness for Domestic Violence. And that is one of your handouts. And I will remind you that the handouts are available in your control panel and will also be provided to you via the follow-up email. So 3 quick statistics. Did you know that housing instability is 4 times more likely for women who have experienced domestic violence? Also, 1 in 4 homeless women cite domestic violence as a major contributor to their homelessness. And lastly, of homeless women and children, over 80% have experienced domestic violence. I wanted to highlight a research study called Creating Safe Housing Options for Survivors, Learning from and Expanding Research, which is also available as a handout. In this research study, they shared 3 evidence-based best practices. The first one was mobile advocacy, which we touched on in the poll earlier, which means working with survivors in their communities and homes, accompanying survivors as they look for housing, go to court, and attempt to secure childcare or health care. The second best practice is flexible funding, which is the need for temporary financial assistance. So funds that are targeted to support survivors as they rebuild their lives, including childcare costs, transportation, school supplies, uniforms, and permits required for employment, as well as time-limited and flexible rental assistance. The third best practice was attending to safety, which is engaging with all survivors in safety planning. They also talked about how services should be provided. So services should be survivor-driven, which means that they are provided in a survivor-driven framework. In other words, the survivor, not the advocate, decided what they would work on and how they would achieve their goals. Services should be provided in a way that's trauma-informed. In this report, they talked about trauma reactions, such as depression, immobility, or PTSD, and that they're often suppressed while a survivor is really focused on securing housing for themselves and their children. So in terms of being an advocate, we want to understand the way that trauma works. So as they're going through that crisis, we want to really be there to support them and make sure that all the work that they put into finding that housing does not become jeopardized. And lastly, the services should be provided in a manner that's voluntary. So low barrier voluntary services that are guided by cultural values of justice and access were believed to promote increased survivor autonomy. So when we put out the registration form, we got a couple questions about housing case management and best practices. And I wanted to be sure to share 3 best practices that I spoke to the consortium about. And I will talk about the consortium in depth later. But they mentioned a couple of other best practices, which included housing first, harm reduction, and progressive engagement. So I just wanted to make sure to share those out with the rest of the audience.
We recognize the following: helping domestic violence survivors find and keep safe and affordable housing is quite complex. The available resources tend to vary based on individual communities. And finding a housing unit within a survivor's budget that will be safe, while also dealing with the survivor and offering their children's trauma, is not by any means a straightforward or easy process. It really is just that, a process. In this 90-minute webinar, our objectives are the following. First, discuss the Fair Housing Act protection for DV, domestic violence victims. 2, share existing resources on housing. They include Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, Safe Housing Partnership, HUD, Housing Counseling, and the Special Needs Assistance Program, SNAPS. Then we'll discuss Smart About Money, SAM, Housing Course, and finally Q&A. Your questions will help us improve this presentation for future and better understand what resources are missing from the conversation.
All right, so the first resource that we wanted to share out today comes to us from the ACLU, and it is the Know Your Rights. They have a variety of different topics, but one of the topics that they do have is specific to survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and you do have the URL for that resource right on the slide. It's at aclu.org. So go ahead and bookmark that if you feel so inclined. But I found this resource to be helpful in breaking down the Fair Housing Act. So basically, the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, or financing of dwellings and in other housing-related activities on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, or national origin. So although a victim of domestic violence is not by virtue of that status protected under the Act, a victim may be protected under the Act's prohibition on sex discrimination. So in this work that we do, a common incident of discrimination would be an eviction as a result of an occurrence of domestic violence. And we'll talk about what to do if you're dealing with discriminatory housing practices on the next slide. But I wanted to briefly touch on that because that was something that we did get a couple of questions about in advance of the webinar, which was around helping survivors find housing who have a criminal record. So I actually discussed these questions with the ACLU Women's Rights Project, and they were very enthusiastic that we were showing the Know Your Rights resources. So definitely check those out and use them. And they did indicate that this is a pretty difficult issue to navigate, but they did share a resource containing HUD guidance on the use of criminal records by providers of housing. And so I'm going to be sure to share that link of that report in the follow-up email. And I also have another resource that I'd like to share regarding housing discrimination, also created by the ACLU Women's Rights Project. So both of those resources will be included in the follow-up email.
This next section is all about using the resources of HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. For information on HUD, please check out that link on the PowerPoint. It's quite a long link, and bookmark that. Using the hand raise tool in your control panel, let's get a show of hands for how many advocates have worked with clients to file a HUD complaint. If anyone would like to share a success story that might be helpful for other attendees to hear, please do so in the question box. Here are 2 tips for working with a victim of domestic violence and you believe that they have been subjected to a discriminatory housing practice. 1, file a complaint with HUD within 1 year after the alleged denial. Link to online form is on the slide, like I mentioned earlier. 2, file a lawsuit in the federal district court within 2 years of the alleged denial. If a complaint is filed with HUD, they will investigate the complaint at no cost to the complainant.
All right, another great resource also offered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, is the Housing Counseling Program. I would like it if the people that have used, if you have worked with clients who've used housing counseling, if you could use the hand raise tool to get a show of hands to let us know if you've used this resource, that would be great. And then also, if anyone would like to share a success story that might be helpful for other attendees to hear, go ahead and enter that success story in the questions box. So as I was researching the Housing Counseling Program, I found that the way that it works is it's all about helping prospective homeowners and renters make responsible choices to address their unique housing needs in light of their financial situation. So some of the things that that program offers, they can help review a client's financial situation and housing needs and provide unbiased expert assistance to help clients resolve their housing problems or needs. They can work with you to design an action plan. And then they also do some referring of clients to appropriate community resources. They can also contact lenders on behalf of their client to help resolve mortgage delinquencies, and also just someone as a sounding board to address unrealistic expectations around housing.
HUD has an e-newsletter specifically geared towards housing counseling. It features the good work of housing counseling agencies across the country and provides great training and best practices. Subscribe at the link posted on the slide.
All right. The Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, SNAPS, administers HUD's Homeless Assistance Program. We'd like to get a show of hands using the hand raise tool for how many programs have received funding through either of these grant programs. And we're asking for success stories today on this webinar, just to help other people understand how to use some of these resources. So if one of your programs is funded by either of these grant programs and you want to share your story, go ahead and just type that into the questions box. So HUD recognizes the intersection between domestic violence and homelessness, as well as the following. They understand that the fact that without permanent housing options to exit from shelter or transitional housing, some survivors may feel that going back to an abuser is their only way out of homelessness. HUD encourages agencies and communities to strike a balance that includes both safe short-term and longer-term options to help stop the cycle of homelessness for households experiencing domestic violence. They have 2 targeted homeless assistance grants programs, the Emergency Solutions Grants, as well as the Continuum of Care program. And you can see on the slide sort of how that breaks down into various types of housing. And whereas neither program is specifically focused on survivors, many domestic violence providers do receive funding from these programs. HUD's definition of homelessness specifically includes any individual or family who is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic or dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other dangerous or life-threatening conditions. As you can see under the Continuum of Care program, the joint component is a new housing option as of 2017 that HUD hopes will work well for survivors of domestic violence. A variation of this model was championed by members of the consortium, which we are going to talk about next. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness affirmed 6 core values in the plan. The first, homelessness is unacceptable. Next, there are no homeless people, but rather people who have lost their homes, who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Homelessness is expensive, and it is better to invest in solutions. Homelessness is solvable. We have learned a lot about what works. Homelessness can be prevented. And lastly, there's strength in community collaboration. So here are the goals of the Opening Doors project. You can kind of take a look at what has been already addressed or what is currently being addressed, and then what they hope to address up until the year 2020. I highly recommend that you all bookmark the safehousingpartners.org as a resource. And I also recommend checking out each of the websites of the Technical Assistance Team for the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, as each of these organizations have a wealth of resources related to housing and domestic violence. And these organizations, their thought leadership has really been essential to helping advocates to navigate this critical intersection. So among that TA team, we have the National Network to End Domestic Violence. We also have the National Alliance for Safe Housing, which is a project of the District Alliance for Safe Housing. We have Collaborative Solutions, as well as the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. So this slide is really all about what does the consortium focus on. So as you're checking out what they do, I wanted to address a couple of questions that came in about from the registration page, and a couple people asked about how to prioritize domestic violence victims on housing waiting lists. And I did speak to the consortium about this, and they wanted me to let you all know that they are happy to provide some feedback and guidance on DV prioritization. And they did mention that it's sort of emerging as a hot topic, and so definitely more to come on that. And that's something we'll also look into, but I do encourage each of you to reach out to their technical assistance team if that's a concern or if that's something you want to learn more about. We also got a fair amount of questions about how to meet housing needs in rural communities. And I wanted to also just share some feedback from the consortium on this. And they're actually currently working on a project to address this specifically. And I know I am going to be reaching out to them to learn more about that, and potentially looking at that as a topic that we would do a full webinar on, because it is important, and they are actually working on a project currently on that. So we'll keep in touch as that work evolves. And this slide just gives you a little bit of information about what their website features. They have some really great advocate and survivor toolkits. I really recommend checking out their site and just exploring it, and also using that site to contact them for technical assistance and training.
When it comes to finding housing, the following can be very helpful. Having copies of your credit report can be helpful because many prospective landlords will often check the credit history of potential tenants. You are entitled to a free credit report every 12 months from each of 3 major consumer reporting companies. They include Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. You can also request a copy from annualcreditreport.com. We got a couple of questions in advance about strategies to improve credit for survivors who have had their credit damaged by an abuser or survivors who need to build credit history. Here are some tips. Number 1, the first tip has to do with repairing your credit report. There are ways to explain negative information on your credit report. You can send the credit bureau an explanation for negative accounts on your credit report, and it will show up in your credit report as a consumer statement. Also, federal law requires lenders and landlords to consider a consumer's explanation, so this could be something you would share with a prospective landlord. Tip number 2 has to do with adding positive information to your credit report. One way to deal with outstanding credit balances. If you're able to pay something toward your outstanding lines of credit, determine how much you can pay and contact the creditor by phone or mail. You can make an offer to pay in full, ask them to accept partial payment as a settlement in full, or arrange for a payment plan. If they agree, document it in writing, then ask the creditor to confirm it in writing. When you have paid the agreed amount in full, ask the creditor to send you a settlement letter showing a 0 balance. Send a copy of the settlement letter to the credit bureau so they can update your credit report. In the Webinar 2 handouts provided in the handout section of your control panel, we have included a My Housing Plan activity, as well as an activity called Tips for Working with My Landlord. We use the acronym SAM for Smart About Money. SAM is NEFI's consumer-focused website providing American adults with action-oriented e-learning courses on foundational financial concepts. There are 7 in-depth courses, including housing, that are about 45 minutes in length if you completed it in one sitting. This slide is the course homepage, and it shows the 7 available courses. There are also 5 money basic courses that cover foundational financial concepts like spending, like savings, credit, debt, and insurance. You can go at your own pace and can access them at any time as long as you have an internet connection. The site is mobile friendly, so you can access it on your cell phone or tablet too. You can register for an account, but you don't have to. The benefits of registering allows you to save your budgets and bookmark specific web page you may want to return occasionally. This is the SAM Housing Table of Contents page. The housing course is very in-depth. It gets you thinking about your living situation and asking questions like, should I rent or should I buy? The course helps you navigate this complex and sometimes overwhelming topic. Using the SAM acronym, the course is divided into 3 sections. 1, size up your situation. 2, analyze your circumstances. 3, make a plan. When you size up your situation, SAM prompts you to think about your current living situation. For example, if you want to rent a different place, how much can you afford to pay in rent? Do you know your credit score? Because a potential landlord will want to look at it to determine if they want to rent to you. When you analyze your circumstances, you will need to think about your situation to determine your specific needs. Do you have children? Do you need 2 or 3 bedroom apartment? Are you sending kids to school? And so are you looking for a certain neighborhood? Really think through the decision and analyze it. Finally, make a plan. This is where you take action. You found the perfect place and want to sign a 12-month lease. Do you understand the lease terms? What if you had to break the lease? What if there's a water leak and you're displaced for several weeks? Do you know your rights as a renter? Do you have renter's insurance? If you have a landlord dispute, where can you turn for help? Know who to contact and look at our housing resource page. This worksheet is an important part of the housing course. We have attached this worksheet as part of the Webinar 2 handouts. It helps you think about how much money you spend on housing. There are 2 important housing terms you should be aware of. 1, cost burden, and 2, debt to income ratio. Are you cost burden? When housing is more than 30% of your monthly income. If your housing costs are more than 30% of your monthly income, then you might be cost burden, meaning that it could be difficult for you to meet other debt obligations. If you're thinking of buying a home, mortgage lenders typically like to see your housing costs no higher than 28% of your gross income. If you do not meet this guideline, you still might be able to get a loan, but your terms would not be the best available. You should be aware of this term if you're renting to. You shouldn't be spending over 28% of your income on rent. What's your debt to income ratio, or DTI? Mortgage lenders typically like to see your debt to income ratio mortgage payments, the principal, interest, tax, and insurance, with acronyms of PITI, and consumer debts taking up no more than 36% of your gross income. If you are currently renting and looking to buy a home, lenders will total your rent, utilities, and renter's insurance to estimate how much you might be able to afford in a mortgage. If you have too much debt, then you might not be able to be a good candidate or qualify to buy a house.
All right. So we actually did get a success story that was shared about the housing discrimination, about that resource that we shared, which is that you would file a complaint through HUD. And one of our participants shared that the person that I was working with had been discriminated against because of her disability. HUD spoke with her and offered additional resources within the state where her discrimination had happened. They also did not make any promises, but that conversation buoyed her to continue her complaint. She was able to get assistance, find a lawyer, and gather witnesses in her case. While in shelter, she was able to create a plan and find housing for herself. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's really helpful to share these types of success stories. So if anyone else on the webinar does also have one that they would like to share, please feel free to just go ahead and type that into the questions box at this time. So we are going to go into our Q&A portion of the webinar. And I'm going to start out with a couple of questions that came in advance and try to touch on some of those different topics so that we can kind of get ideas flowing, and hopefully that will inspire more people to ask questions. So we got a good amount of questions in about types of housing. So when we were creating the webinar, we initially titled it Transitional Housing, but as I was advised by the consortium, I did change the title to a more of a introductory webinar about housing options for domestic violence survivors. So really a 101 type of a conversation about housing. But I did want to respond to a couple of questions about what is the difference between transitional housing and how does that compare to rapid rehousing? And as I was discussing this with the consortium, they shared that this is sort of a loaded question because they're two different housing models. They're very different, and they also look different across funding streams. So each community really should determine, based on local needs and housing options, what types of housing models make sense. And so I think I just wanted to touch on that because I know that this conversation really looks different depending on what community you are a part of. So definitely reach out to the Technical Assistance Consortium if you have specific questions about types of housing. We did get a couple of questions about agencies that are currently offering transitional housing. So thinking about how to best handle, someone asked, how do you best handle substance abuse issues and unapproved guests? And again, I did consult with the consortium on this, and they thought that they wanted to just share that programs should be using a housing first approach. And again, the housing first is one of those best practices that we look to. So if you're not currently using that, that would definitely be something to look into. In addition to the housing first best practice, we also shared the harm reduction best practice as well as the progressive engagement. And those are all considered to be best practices as it relates to housing. Yeah, we got a lot of questions about best practices. So thank you all for submitting those. One that I thought was interesting though was how much is too much help? How to encourage clients to be compliant with the housing program. So again, sharing those best practices and really thinking about how we're providing that case management, those can be very helpful. We did touch on a little bit about how to serve survivors who have bad credit or who have damaged credit or previous evictions. So we did touch on that with those 2 tips, and you can review that when you get to, when you review the recording, you can go through our 2 tips that we provided on how to help clients improve their credit as a result of damaged credit due to domestic abuse or financial abuse. Rural communities, I did touch on, which I do encourage you also to reach out to the Technical Assistance Consortium about their upcoming work in that area around serving rural communities. It was very informative to us that we had so many attendees tuning in from rural communities. So it's something that's definitely on our radar, and hopefully we can all take some time and look more into that, and we will definitely be sure to share some information as it is available. And then lastly, a lot of comments came in or questions came in about the rights of survivors. So what are the rights? What rights does a survivor have if the house is in her name, but the abuser pays? And again, these kinds of questions can be very complicated, but I definitely want to refer you to that ACLU resource, the Know Your Rights. And then I am also sharing out 2 different resources that I mentioned previously about housing discrimination around housing and domestic violence. So those will be coming out in the follow-up email. All right, so let's see if we have any other questions. Are there suggestions for a DV victim who has been refused public housing because of rent arrears from when the victim lived with the abuser? There is a large dollar amount and the victim has little financial resources at this time. So on our last webinar, someone asked us, how can you help, or how can you serve a survivor who doesn't have a lot of income? And there was a response that I thought was really helpful. So financial abuse often includes not having access to any of the bills or having no knowledge of basic expenses. And I think it can be helpful to create a list of low income cost of living so that when that person is able to acquire some income, then they'll have that list of sort of what a future budget would look like. But I think, yes, it's building up those basic financial literacy skills in that time can be very helpful. As we were researching and doing a lot of, when we were reaching out to the consortium and other agencies about this webinar, it was very helpful to all of us, all of the questions that you all are sending in, because it just shows that there's quite a lot to still discuss on this topic, but also still a lot that is not known or that is not, that we could learn more about. So thank you for all of these questions. All right, another question came in. Do you have any suggestions on how to support an undocumented survivor in obtaining safe, affordable housing? This was something that came up several times on our first webinar, the webinar 1 in this series. And so it was something that we looked into, and I did share a resource from our last webinar, which can be found on Affordable Housing Online. And they have a guide which has to do with housing for immigrants, which explains that federal affordable housing programs are open to immigrants. And it just shares the eligibility requirements for those programs and describes other resources that can help in terms of immigrant households finding apartments that they can afford. So that was one resource that I found. And this is also something that our agency we're hoping to be able to learn more about. I'm grateful for the resources like the Technical Assistance Consortium to help navigate issues that are very complex in terms of how can we really serve the undocumented and immigrant populations. All right, let's take a couple more questions before we wrap up. How would you suggest assisting clients finding housing when there's a limited job market, very, very limited, and unaffordable housing market, and no homeless shelter? So I think if I was going to do that, or if I was going to suggest anything, it would be to connect with the government, state, city, or county housing resources in your community. I would start there. And other than that, you could see if there's any nonprofit organizations or other coalitions or community-based organizations in your area that provide housing resources. I would definitely utilize those HUD resources, so the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I think, and then in addition to that, reaching out to the Technical Assistance Consortium with any specific questions about housing and how to build a housing program in your shelter. I think those are all resources that I would recommend starting with.
Can I suggest something too? Habitat is a national nonprofit group throughout the U.S. and very well known for its work. I also would start with them. They might not be the primary source, but they also know how to direct people to other resources.
Yeah, so I'm getting a lot of really similar questions just around helping people who are facing multiple barriers. So I think given that this is a really more of an introductory webinar, I would really go through all the resources that we suggested in this webinar. So going through those HUD resources, taking a look at the Safe Housing Partnerships website. These questions that are coming in are pretty general around how can I provide a victim of domestic violence housing when there's no housing available. So I think, like I said, each community really has a different set of circumstances as it relates to housing. And so it's important to really be able to know the resources in your local community, but also know some of the resources that are available at the federal and national levels. Yes, HUD is a national program, so it is available nationwide. It's a U.S. federal program. Okay, it doesn't actually look like I'm getting too many more questions, so I think we'll wrap it up from there. And as a reminder, you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow, which will contain a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as all of the handouts that I mentioned today, including a certificate of participation and a variety of other very, I think, valuable handouts, including research, some more legal ones relating to housing discrimination, but should be able to serve you in terms of building that foundation and learning about what housing options are available for victims of domestic violence. I wanted to make a quick plug for the NCADV conference, which is in September. So September 23rd through the 26th, and you can go to ncadv.org/conference to register. And then lastly, another quick plug for the Remember My Name program. We are accepting names for the 2017 poster, and you can go ahead and submit a name to the registry at ncadv.org/remember-my-name. And thank you all so much for all of your participation in today's webinar, and have a wonderful rest of your day.